Hello friends, welcome back. So in this session we will learn ServletConfig and ServletContext in Servlet. So what is ServletConfig? ServletConfig is an interface. ServletConfig is an interface that is available into Java x.servlet package, and web container vendor is responsible to give the implementation for this. Means web container is only the responsible to give the subclass for ServletConfig. So that is nothing but the implementation only. So currently what we are using, which web container we are using our Tomcat 9.0 server. So Tomcat is our web container, and that web container only giving the implementation for ServletConfig. Okay, every servlet has its own ServletConfig that can be used within the servlet only. Means each servlet has its own ServletConfig. ServletConfig will not be shared among all the servlets. Suppose if we have created 10 servlets, so for that 10 servlets we have to specify their parameters explicitly, and that will be related to the particular servlet only. That will not be shared among all the servlets. Okay, so every servlet has its own ServletConfig that can be used within the servlet only and cannot be shared. Okay, if we want to use any data which is common for all the user, because servlet is for user only and all the users can access servlet if it is accessible. So if we want to use any data which is common for all the users but specific for a particular servlet, data we want to use for all the users but only within the particular servlet, so we have to go with ServletConfig parameter. Then but specific for the particular servlet, then the data can be specified as ServletConfig parameter. Okay, when the web container initialize a servlet, means when the servlet is being initialized using init method, we have seen in our servlet init method is there, and for this init method if you see one parameter is there. What is the type of that parameter? That parameter type is ServletConfig only. So whenever your servlet is being initialized by the web container, then web container only will create the ServletConfig from the parameter whatever you have specified, and it will your web container will create a ServletConfig, and your web container will pass that ServletConfig to this method only, because to call init method we need a ServletConfig. Obviously we need a ServletConfig object, then only we can call this init method. So who is calling this init method? Your web container is calling. So web container needs to supply this ServletConfig parameters, this ServletConfig object here. So how your web container is creating? Your web container is creating servlet on the basis of a configuration, whether you have used XML configuration or whether you have used annotation configuration. However, it will take from that configuration, your web container will take the configuration parameter and will create a ServletConfig object and will call to this one. Now that is our job. After that one, that is our job how we want to use this ServletConfig. Whether we want to store that field as a local variable, we can do so, or we can use here. We want to use here only, we can use here, or we want to take any parameter from that one, and that using that parameter we want to make some database connection or anything that we can do. That is our job here. And inside the destroy we can close that resource. That is also our job here. So when the web container initialize a servlet, it create a servlet config object for servlet, and servlet config object is used to pass information to servlet during initialization by getting configuration information from the web.xml. That can be deployment descriptor, means configuration you can give into web.xml, that is nothing but deployment descriptor, or by getting configuration in from web servlet annotation. That is up to your choice how you did the configuration. If you did the configuration from web.xml, your web container will take the configuration parameter from the web.xml only. If you used web servlet annotation, then your web container will take the configuration from this annotation only, and it will create the servlet config object. Your web container will create servlet config object and it will pass. Okay, so servlet configuration can be done into descriptor file and in annotation also. Both you can specify. So how will you specify into descriptor configuration? So descriptor configuration, if you see, this is nothing but a web.xml configuration only. So here we have, so far we have used only the servlet tag, and we closed the servlet tag. Under this servlet, we what configuration we specified? We specified these two configuration only: servlet name and servlet class. What will be the name of servlet? Any name we can give, whatever our wish, that name we can give, and this should be the class name, fully qualified class name. So params, show params is our servlet, that is created by extending HTTP servlet. Okay, so that servlet we have specified here, and for this servlet, for this servlet only, show parameter, I want to specify some parameter. So that parameter you can specify like that: init param. You have to use tag init param, and you can close that init param tag, and inside this init param tag you can specify your parameter using param name and param value tag. Param name will specify the name of parameter. What should be the name? Employee name. Okay, and what should be the value? The value should be Ram Nivas, or any other value, any other parameter name and parameter value you can give. And this can be repeated, this init param, this tag can be repeated n number of times. If you want to specify 100 parameters key value, you can repeat this 100 times. You can give that configuration 100 times, means it will create, when servlet config object will be only one. From this servlet config object only we can get the parameters. How many parameters are there? Like 2, 3, 4, 5, all you can get. You can get the parameter name, you can get the parameter value, you can get both. Okay, so param name and param value you can specify, and you can repeat this tag. So like that we can specify our servlet config. Okay, next one is you can specify your configuration for servlet config using annotation on also. Web servlet annotation you can use. So far we have seen this much only. We can specify URL pattern and name. Along with these you can specify init params also. Init params is nothing but another field that is defined into web servlet annotation, and that value is an array. Array of what? Array of web init param annotation. Annotation inside annotation we are supplying. That also possible, we can do so, means that is nothing but type init param. See here, if you see URL pattern, for this URL pattern value is what? Value is an array. Value is an array. Array of what type? Array of a string type. You can specify n number of parameter you can specify like that. URL A, URL B, after this one comma, URL B, URL C, you can specify, because this is an array. In the same way, init param is also an array. Init param is also an array, but for this array the type is not a string. Type is another annotation. That annotation name is web init param, and for this web init param you can see name and value is the fields. Name and value are the fields for that one. So this, now you can repeat this annotation. Currently we have given 2 times. You can copy this much, after comma you can add another annotation. So you can repeat this one in the same way. How can you repeat in XML? You can repeat this one, you can repeat this tag, and here you can repeat this annotation. Simple. Okay, so this is nothing but the servlet config, and servlet config is unique for every servlet and its parameter also. Okay, that we will see through example also. Okay, next one is servlet context. So same as servlet config, servlet context is also there, and servlet context is also an interface that is available under Java x.servlet package only, and web container only, or web container vendor only responsible to give the implementation or to give the subclass for servlet context. Only web container vendor. So currently we are using Tomcat, so Tomcat vendor only have to provide this implementation, because this is just an interface. We have to use only, we have to just use. Whoever is developing web container, they only have to give the implementation. Okay, one web application will have only one servlet context. So from this statement, what we can say? We can say that servlet context is shared among all the servlets. Servlet context is shared among all the servlets, but servlet config is not shared among all the config. Every servlet has its own servlet config. So that is the difference between servlet config and servlet context. Servlet context is only one for one application, and that one object servlet context is shared with all the servlets. Okay, if we want to use any data which is common for all the user and common for all the servlet, then we can specify servlet context parameter. We can use servlet context parameter. And one more thing, this servlet context parameter you can only specify using web.xml. You cannot specify using annotation. Why it is so? Because this servlet context is common for all the servlet. So in which servlet you will specify, you cannot decide that one, you cannot specify that one. Only into web.xml you can specify, because web.xml is only the one file that is common for all the servlets. So all the servlets will take the configuration from that only. So that's why servlet context is for servlet context, configuration can only be given into web.xml file. Okay, for every web application a servlet context object is created by web container only, and web container where it will pass, see here only servlet config is there. So from this servlet config only you can get servlet context. See, we will see from how we can get the object for servlet context. See, this is servlet context, this is servlet config. So how I am getting the servlet context object, servlet context I am getting from servlet config only. Servlet config dot get servlet context. Okay, currently I am getting in this way. So many other ways are also there how we can get. Okay, so for every web application, servlet context object is created by the web container. Servlet context object is used to get configuration information from deployment descriptor only, which will be available for all the servlets or JSP that is the part of your web application. Note, servlet context can only be configured into deployment descriptor file. There is no other way to configure it by Java annotation. If we want to specify in Java only, then simply what you can do, you can create a new file. Inside that one you can define your static fields. Simple, that will be fine, you can do that one. Okay, but using annotation you cannot do the configuration for servlet context. Okay, so here is the configuration for deployment descriptor. How you just have to use context param tag. Simple, this one tag is enough. So this tag can be repeated n number of times. Suppose currently what I am giving here, context param. Context param, what is the name of that parameter? SQL driver. What is the value for that one? Any SQL driver like localhost 3306 mysql / mysql, any driver, any SQL path or URL you can give. Okay, another one is the URL, username. This one is the username is root, password is root. So like that we can specify n number of context param, and this context param will be set to servlet context only. So that's why they are given context param. Okay, and here also for servlet context two values are there, param name and param value. Another one is description, also you can give param description that will not be given into servlet context. Description to understand from developer side only, so that's a developer can easily understand what is the purpose for this one, so you can give that another one. Okay, that is fine. Okay, so now how we can get the servlet context object? We can get servlet context object from the following objects: from servlet request, from servlet config we are getting from HTTP session. Okay, we will discuss what exactly servlet request, what is servlet request, what is servlet response, what is HTTP session. We will discuss this in our upcoming sessions. Okay, so this is about the servlet context and servlet config. Now let's see the example. Okay, so if you see here, that is another one. Yeah, so if you see here, we have created two servlet. One is show param, another one is show param 2. So and this show param 1 show param and show param 2 is returning only this result.html file, and result.html is nothing but, please see the console for servlet context and servlet config parameter key and value. So that is nothing but we are just we are just printing the servlet context key value and servlet config key value into console only, so that's we can observe simply. Okay, so that is fine. Now if you see the code of servlet config, code for show param. So inside show param, if you see, using this initialization, using this init method, what we are doing, we are initializing servlet config and servlet context, and while destroying we are setting to null simply. And inside our do get method, this method is processing the client request. So in process of client request, what I am doing, I am printing all the key and value. How I am getting the key value? See, using servlet context dot get init param. Servlet context, this is servlet context. First I am getting from the servlet context. So servlet context dot get init param names. So only the names will come. How many names will be there? It will come. And here what I am doing, I am iterating that names. Names it will collect in form of enumeration of a string type. Okay, and that I am iterating here. After iterating, what I am doing, I am getting that param name. So this is a param name, and that param name I am appending to this string builder. After that one, after this column, I am appending the parameter value. How I am getting the value I am getting using this one. You can get if I want, you for clear understanding, I can put this here. This is nothing but string param value. Simple, that's it. String, this is a param value, and this param value we can specify here. That is also fine. Okay, fine. In the same way I am doing for servlet config also. I am iterating the servlet config. First what I am doing, I am getting all the servlet config parameter names in form of enumeration, because it will return only the enumeration of a string type, and that enumeration I am iterating. I am iterating here, and in iteration I am getting servlet name and parameter name and parameter value. This is the parameter name and this one is the parameter param value. Simple, param value. Okay, and this param value we can append here, and this is fine. Okay, the simple thing, we are printing what is the parameter name and what is the parameter value, what is the parameter name for servlet context and what is the parameter name for servlet config, and what is the parameter value we are printing corresponding. Okay, the corresponding name and value of a servlet context parameter we are printing, and here we are printing the corresponding name and value for servlet config. Okay, that is fine. So what are the parameters we have specified for show params? If you see the web.xml, in that we have specified in for show params we have specified the param in web.xml file only. Yes, so if you see the web.xml file, we have specified these three parameters. What is the parameters? Key 1 value 1, key 2 value 2, key 3 value 3. Simple, very simple. Description you can ignore, that is, if you want to add description you can add, that is only to helpful for developer only, because developer will understand what is the purpose of this init param, what is the purpose. So currently param 1 description simply I am giving, that's it. Okay, fine. And what are the context parameter we are specifying here? Servlet context, servlet config is fine. Now what is the servlet context? For servlet context we have specified these three parameters: MySQL URL, MySQL username, MySQL password. So these three we have specified here. Fine. MySQL URL, this one is the URL you can specify. MySQL password, username, this root, MySQL password, root. Simple. So this is these three are the servlet context parameter. Okay, so the name is this one. Okay, and servlet config show params 2. For show params 2 servlet we have given the configuration in form of web servlets only, in form of annotation only. Here we have used web servlet annotation to config the servlet context and servlet context and servlet config. To configure servlet context and servlet config for show params servlet we have used web.xml file, and to configure servlet context and to configure the servlet config we have used annotation web servlet annotation. Okay, fine. So here, as we have already discussed, we can use init params. Other are fine. URL patterns you can give any pattern, no issue. Load on startup if you want to give, you can give. And init params you can give init params here. Init param is nothing but an array of what? Array of web init param annotation, and this annotation we can repeat multiple times. So how many times we have repeated? 3 times we have repeated this annotation. Okay, fine. So this is servlet context and servlet config. Now I will run this one and I will show you the output. Okay, yeah, now it is started, and I will go to the console and I will clear this console first. And now what I will do, I will call the show params. This one is the first controller. That configuration we have specified in web.xml file. Okay, So it is not coming here, nothing is printing. Why? Because what is happening, sometime your web browser or your web client will not send the request to server. It will take from the cache. It will take this one from the cache. Because why? Because we have already called this URL sometime before we have already called this URL. We have sent the request already. So your client is not sending, sometime it is not sending request to the server, it is taking from the cache if it is available. Yes, this page was available and this page doesn't have any change, so that's why it will not call the server. So what in that case, what we have to do, we have to press Control and F5. In that case, what it will take, it will not take this from the cache. Your web client will call the server again. So if you see now it is coming. So this is okay, fine, this is initialization related, that is fine. Now here if you see, what is the value for servlet context? For servlet context we have specified MySQL URL, password and username. These three parameters we have specified only. If you see in web.xml, you can see for servlet context we have specified MySQL URL, username and password. These three parameters only we have specified for servlet context, and that only we are getting here. If you see, that only we are getting, yes, that only we are getting here, 3. And this we have specified for ServletConfig. Yes, this is for ServletConfig. And if I call the URL show param 2, that is a show param 2 servlet. For that one what will be the output? This servlet context will same, but servlet config will change. Why? Because definition says every servlet has its own servlet config, and that will not be shared. But one web application will have only one servlet context. So it means one object servlet context is shared with all the servlets. Okay, fine. So here this servlet context will be same, but servlet config will be different. Okay, so just send this one. Again it is not calling. Okay, just press Control and F5. Sometime it will, if page is not changed in from the backend, it will not call. Okay, see, now it's calling. So here if you see, for this one also, for servlet 2 also, the servlet context values are same, username, MySQL, password, but servlet config value is changing. Here variable name is name, here key 3 is there variable, here variable name is location Bengaluru, here key 2, here designation software engineer, here key 1 is value 1. That's it. So this is all about the servlet context and servlet config, and why we need to use servlet context and servlet config. To initialize the servlet means we want to make a connection, so that connection we can make, or any other configuration or any other value that is required for the users, we can do using servlet context and servlet config. Okay, so that is only the use of servlet context and servlet config. Okay, in the next session we will see servlet request and servlet response. So I hope you like this session. Please subscribe my channel and we will see you in the next session. Till that, bye bye and thanks for watching.